Welcome to the Season 2 of the India Energy Hour podcast. The India Energy Hour podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements, and science. The podcast is hosted by energy transition researcher and author Dr. Sandeep Pai and senior energy and climate journalist Shreya Jay. The show is produced by multimedia journalist Tejas Dayananda Sagar.
In the history of the global climate change conferences, it was in the recent COP26 that for the first time there was a separate water pavilion. Water economy management has faced negligence on the climate discussion table till yet, but it is time that water is given the center stage. Water forms the key bridge in the energy food supply chain. Water resource management will be crucial to the energy transition planning of India, where till 2 years back, there was no separate department to focus on water scarcity. In this episode, we are joined by Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Principal Researcher, International Water Management Institute. We will discuss the water energy food nexus, how clean energy and water conservation go hand in hand, and the role water will play in climate adaptation. Dr. Mukherjee has close to 2 decades of experience working in the water resource management space. She is considered an authority on groundwater governance, energy irrigation nexus, and community management of water resources.
Welcome, Aditi, to the India Energy Hour. This is our second season, and so we're really excited to start this new season with you as our guest. And I'm really looking forward to talking about a wide range of issues. But before we dive in, let's start with your journey. So tell us about your professional journey, how and why you chose to study food, water, energy nexus issues, and all various variety of different issues that you have studied. Tell us about where you are from and how you got into this area and where you are through your years of work.
Thank you so much, Sandeep, and thank you for having me on this podcast of yours. I would start in 2001. That's exactly 20 years ago when I started as a junior consultant at the InvIT program. I had recently graduated from IIT Mumbai. I had done my MPhil there. And I started working on issues around, this office was run by Dr. Harsh Shah, who, as you know, has done quite path-breaking work in terms of understanding groundwater economy of India. So that our initial work was a lot of focus on groundwater. When I started in 2001, you would find it very surprising to know that we had to go to conferences and convince people that India's green revolution owed a lot more to groundwater than to surface water. In 2001, for instance, there was still this whole notion that it was the canal, especially Bhakra Nangal canal system in Punjab, that has started green revolution, and very little realization, even though the data was staring at your face, that area under groundwater irrigation had increased. So it was that time, and now it seems surprising because now everybody understands the crucial role that groundwater played. Having said that, my own work, I think what triggered interest was a lot of the studies that were there around groundwater at that time was from northwestern India and southern India, and the discourse that was also shaping up, and quite rightly so, was around groundwater depletion, groundwater scarcity, and what it would do to food production. So that way, I think in the last 20 years, that discourse is still going on. We are still in that kind of a same kind of an impasse that we were 20 years ago. So what struck me was that almost lack of literature from places like West Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, Assam, as if Eastern Indian wasn't using. So the general consensus was also that, Eastern India gets a lot of rainfall, so perhaps irrigation is not important there. So I think that I found that a bit curious, and because I am from the region, I thought that let me do some field work there. And that was a fantastic office. We were very young, all of us were young, but we had a lot of freedom to kind of do the kind of things that we wanted to do. And that's how, when I started working in West Bengal, and I found that that the narrative around scarcity still holds in West Bengal, but here the scarcity is not physical scarcity of water. In Northwest India or in Southern India, you are actually talking of groundwater not being available. You were talking about digging wells in Southern India and not having groundwater resources. But here in Eastern India, what you are talking about is that even though you get water at 10 feet, the cost of extracting that water is huge. There is what is called an economic scarcity of water, because either you don't have access to electricity. When you have access to electricity, it's really difficult to get electricity connection. Then most of the farmers were using diesel pumps. So I think that kind of paradox got me quite intrigued. For example, in Punjab, a farmer could literally get water from a tube well that was 100-150 feet deep and pay literally nothing for it, while a farmer in Bihar or West Bengal could get water at 10 feet but was paying at least 10 to 15 times more per unit of water than a Punjab farmers. So that kind of dichotomy. So you have almost free for all of groundwater as far as groundwater is concerned in places that are literally running out of groundwater. And then you have these places like Eastern India, which receives huge amount of rainfall. There's alluvial aquifer, lot of recharge, but your policies are such that farmers cannot even afford to use that groundwater to increase their productivity. I think that kind of took me on a journey to understand why this access to resource difference exists. And I thought that much of it had to do with rural politics. It has very little to do with the resource per se. So, I mean, to sum up, groundwater policies in India have nothing to do with managing the resource scarcity, but it's mostly almost entirely dependent on how the farmer lobbies play out, how the politics of food affordability plays out, who has a say in the central government, voices. So that kind of, so I think that was, and I have been fortunate enough in some ways to also have to be able to stick through this larger narrative for the last 20 years or so. So that's kind of more or less how I started.
It's fascinating. I just have a quick follow up on, like, why is the rate so different? Like, if you have to summarize in a few sort of like bullet points, why is the regime so different, say, compared to Punjab and West Bengal?
So I think we have to go back a little bit to the history for that. Like when the Green Revolution started, there were all kinds of assumptions being made. It was said that the Green Revolution would work best in Northwest India, where there was like everything else was there except water. So if you look at those, in the 1960s, intensive district development program, and then followed by intensive area agricultural area program. Those two were kind of the things that started Green Revolution. So there are certain districts were chosen to start the Green Revolution experiment. So those were the districts that were given credit, that were given facilities like mini kits of Green Revolution technologies, etc. And none of the West Bengal districts, for example, and for that matter, not many of the Eastern India districts made into that initial selection of districts which were prioritized for Green Revolution, because of this understanding that Eastern India somehow wasn't suitable for high production agriculture because of its high humidity, etc., that the new technology wasn't suitable. Which in hindsight, I kind of think that wasn't quite correct, because you look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh has exactly the same agroecology as West Bengal, but Bangladesh actually, since it became independent in 1971, has also pursued very similar high-yielding variety-led, Green Revolution-led trajectory like Northwestern India has done, except that in Bangladesh it has been rice revolution instead of rice wheat revolution. So I would think that there was a certain amount of preconceived notion that where Green Revolution is suitable, where it's not. The fact that the politics also played a big role. I think once Green Revolution technologies became embedded, we also had those farmer lobbies which were quite strong in Punjab, which were quite strong in places like Gujarat and elsewhere. And I think a lot of the strength of farmer lobbies have been explained in the literature through the caste politics, through, so while in Eastern India, farmer lobbies have been traditionally weaker in comparison. So I would think like started with policies, then those interests got entrenched through these existing farmer lobbies, and Eastern India perhaps never had a very strong voice in the central decision making. Most of the state governments were always belonged to the opposition party compared to who was in power in the center. So I think all of those reasons, but the central reason I feel that the farmer voices for Eastern India have not been enough strongly represented, and part of the reason is that these are not middle-ranking farmers in the sense that these are not large, middle, medium-sized farmers. These are really small farmers. Usually they are lower caste farmers, so-called lower caste farmers. So there isn't one unique like farming community. You don't have Patel farmers, you don't have Jat farmers. So all those kind of factors have made that the farmers have never been very vocal about their all these demands. So I think a lot has to do with that kind of difference in farmer politics.
You were discussing your journey and your experiences across, where all you traveled, especially in Eastern India. I had a little bit of personal question, that is there any personal experience that pushed you further in this? And the reason why I ask is that my reason is that usually in this nexus of water, energy, food, and their scarcity rather, it leads to push women folks towards much more adversity in an area than the men folk. And we have discussed in our one of our prior episodes on energy security, where across regions, across cultures, is the women folk. So have you experienced something like that which pushed you in the direction to explore these issues further, just out of curiosity?
Yes, I mean, you are correct, but in this context, perhaps not. The gender focus in my work came in a bit later. I was kind of more intrigued by the regional differences. So my initial training was in geography at JNU, and we studied in this center called Center for Studies in Regional Development. So I think we were taught to think a lot between why policies and outcomes differ between regions. So I think that was the primary inquiry. And I still remember when I was doing my PhD, one thing that struck with me, and perhaps is there in one of my earlier papers, was what intrigued me was also the difference in the attitude of the policymakers towards farmers. So I did some comparison between Gujarat and on West Bengal. And I remember meeting a member of then Gujarat Electricity Board and the Gujarat Water Resource Development, GWRDC, I forget the full form, but they look at after groundwater. And in their constant conversations, they were saying that we cannot be hard on the farmers. And they kept using the term becharu khedut, the poor, like bechare farmers. And then when I talked to in West Bengal to the same departments, groundwater department, electricity department, the word I kept hearing was farmers are like in Bangla, it's called Shubidevadi, which is opportunist. Opportunist farmers who is trying to loot the system at every opportunity. And that struck me so prominently because in Gujarat, we were talking of relatively well-off farmers, and here we were talking of really small marginal farmers, but the huge difference in the state, in the attitude. And one of the reasons I figured out was that in the instance of West Bengal, a lot of time these officials had very little understanding of the rural realities. They were the Bhadraloks, they were the descendants, like most of us in Calcutta, of one way or the other, of absentee landlords. And while in a place like, say, either in Punjab or Gujarat, you have one brother who is working in the electricity department and another brother is actually still agriculture or a farmer. So the link between the urban and rural is much stronger in many other states than it's in West Bengal. So it's still a very much urban intelligentsia-led kind of movement. So I think not so much the gender concern, what really motivated me was this difference in attitude towards farmers and what the farmers' needs are. So I think that was it. But I think over the years, the concern that came around gender and deprivation came a lot more later in my work around the mountain springs when we started, and just the unimaginable hard work that and deprivation that went into collecting water for the women folk in the mountain was mind-blowing. The other thing that came out very clearly in the mountains and in the springs was something that we don't talk enough about is the caste deprivation. Upper caste always, almost in all cases, have access to the springs, which often is the only source of water in the village, the spring that has the highest discharge, the spring that is located bang in the middle of the settlement, those would be where the upper caste people would go and fetch their water. Again, women folk from upper caste will fetch their water, while women from Dalit families would have to go to fetch water in springs that have smaller discharge, marginal springs that are mostly located from outside the main settlements, mostly located in the jungles or something like that. So I think the difference in caste difference in access to drinking water was something that I became, of course, I had read all about it, but I saw a lot of first-hand experience of it while working in the mountains in the context of spring water. So I think gender concerns are super important, but we also need to use this intersectional lens to look at it. And for India, there is nothing as important as looking at water access through the lens of caste, because that's where rubber hits the road, so to say, because that's where a lot of discrimination is still happening.
No, this is really interesting. There are so many layers to this issue of a scarcity in India. Before we dwell much into it, I wanted to first understand that what do you think is the genesis of this issue? Does it start from energy scarcity in these places? Because we are talking about areas which are biodiversity rich, which have natural resources. So do you think it at all starts with the scarcity of energy and energy security in these regions, and then goes into much more micro issues of, as we mentioned, the food nexus, the water food nexus, the energy food nexus, and then later issues of gender, and as you discovered, caste and everything which is prevalent? So where do you pinpoint the genesis?
You mean of this economic water scarcity in places like Eastern India, that farmers?
Yeah.
So I think energy plays an incredibly important role. It's also a matter of infrastructure. Eastern India, for instance, had electrification process much later than the rest of India. So there is this entire regional development angle that plays out. My own ancestral village, they got electricity. It's near Sundarban. So places like those, we got electricity as late as 2000, 2001. I have had my extended family living in those villages and not having electricity till around 20 years ago. So I think energy plays an incredibly important part in that discussion, as you rightly pointed out, Shreya. What also plays an important role in this is, I think, this whole our whole narrative around food security. And I think in the 60s and the 70s, that was such an overarching narrative, and perhaps rightly so, because that was a time when there were real food scarcity. So at that time, perhaps it seemed expedient that the kind of green revolution that we had was the only way forward. And at that time, it was decided that, okay, these are the paths which are more equipped towards producing these high intensity, high resource intensive ways of agriculture. A lot of the investments also went in those places. So electrification happened in Northwest India much earlier. A lot of the rural electrification actually helped in extracting groundwater. And because I think Eastern India wasn't seen as a part where you could do a lot of food production, these places were always seen as places where you would at best have subsistence agriculture. And because it was thought that, oh, there's a lot of rainfall, there's no need for irrigation. So I don't think electrification, irrigation, food security is something that came into the equation here, and therefore part of the reason perhaps which explains late electrification in Eastern India. So that's I think energy plays an incredibly important role in this whole different trajectories of growth, if you put it that way.
That's great. And I'm glad that you touched upon both water, energy, and food security issues, which I think is your extreme expertise. So let's go and delve about that food, water, energy nexus in the context of climate change and climate adaptation. How are these related, food, energy, water nexus, related to climate change adaptation efforts in India?
As you all know, that is things like floods and those kind of things get a lot of attention. Extreme events get a lot of attention, but what's really happening on the ground are also slow onset events like droughts. If you go into droughts, you would see that the major impacts are happening in places which are predominantly rain fed, with not even, so when I say rain fed, uh, I mean places which don't even get supplemental groundwater irrigation. So a lot of our central India, a lot of our Deccan Plateau area, a lot of our southern India are in those categories where it's the production is entirely rain fed, with very little supplemental irrigation that comes from groundwater. While on the other hand, places that are that have good irrigation investment already, you would see that whenever things like rainfall variability happens, or one of the things that climate change is also doing is changing the date of onset of monsoon, changing the monsoon intensity. So you would have fewer more intensive rainfall spells, and then you have a longer gap in between. So what I'm trying to say is that wherever you don't have irrigation infrastructure are the places that are actually getting more affected. In some ways, irrigation therefore is an adaptation strategy that kind of is helping cover up for some of these rainfall variability, changes in timing, etc. But then the catch there is that so much of our irrigation is groundwater, and that groundwater itself is carbon intensive. So while irrigation is a good and an effective adaptation measure, but it is not necessarily reducing the climate risk, because these are also carbon intensive work. So I feel that there is a bit of a dichotomy there in saying that irrigation is really something that we need to promote. But how do we promote irrigation without adding to the carbon emissions? And I think that's a crucial question that we need to answer. We also need to answer questions like irrigation won't be a solution in many areas where there is absolute physical scarcity of water. So what do we do in those places? In many places, rain-fed agriculture has already become and will increasingly become completely unviable. So what are the options for those people? So I feel that we need to think of now like providing access to irrigation, but providing that access to irrigation in a way that isn't as carbon intensive as we have known. And then the answers lies, of course, in how fast can we decarbonize the grid, and then electricity becomes more cleaner, then more electric grids, or the other option that India is going quite away is around solar irrigation, which is you can have solar irrigation once you have decarbonized the grid, or you can have standalone solar pumps or grid connected solar pumps. So a lot of our investments are going, I think, both ways. I mean, India is going towards decarbonizing. I think currently 25% of our electricity comes from renewable energy, though that includes hydro, and I'm not quite sure whether that's even a good classification. But having said that, a lot of our current investments in agriculture is around solar irrigation, and that's another whole new issue. That's something that we in EMI are currently working on. I have a project looking at trajectories of solar irrigation in 4 countries, and happy to talk about a bit more later on during this.
So let's just get into the solar irrigation. It's a very interesting project that the country has taken. And you mentioned two things, that either the grid should be decarbonized, or solar or green energy in these irrigation areas should be pushed upon. What do you think is a better idea? Because the experience, if you look around the globe, has been that the source should be where the demand is. The source of energy should be near where the demand is, and that is, I think, the basis of this particular Kusum project that we have started, the solar irrigation. So if you can explain, based on your experience, that how does green energy help irrigation in these areas, and what kind of green energy solution should ideally work, especially in rural areas, and also areas where irrigation is possible due to a lot of water or due to less water? What kind of role will clean energy play in all this?
So first, if we talk about mitigation in agriculture, there are lots of ways you can mitigate, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What I find quite attractive about this entire solar irrigation business is, compared to other mitigation measures, like, when you try to mitigate methane emissions from rice, it almost always ends up reducing your rice productivity. And when you're reducing rice productivity of very smallholder farmers, you're hurting their incomes. Similarly, I mean, think of most other mitigation measures that has a negative impact income component. somehow solar irrigation pumps are would be actually are they're simply replacing one source of energy with another, and there should not necessarily be in any negative impact of negative income effect that way. So I think that solar irrigation, like, and this is an important aspect of mitigation in India, where almost like 15 to 20% of your carbon emissions from agriculture comes from irrigation. So anyway, it's an important source. So coming to how it works, it just works as solar pumps principally work like any other pump, any other electric pump, except that you have a row of solar panels that are generating that electricity there right on the spot. And these pumps are connected to the solar panels. And usually all our pumps are AC pumps, while the solar panels are producing DC. So usually you would have an inverter that converts that DC electricity to AC. But right now, the technology is such that any off-the-shelf pump, it's not as if you need a special solar pump or anything. Any pump that works on an electric tube well will also work as a. So the only thing is that you would have this series of panels on your farm which is producing electricity. So coming back to Shreya, your question, I think Kusum has all those components. Kusum is this, I forget the full form right now, but it has
It's
all
a very
these.
difficult full form. It's Krishi
Yes.
Utthan, so
Yeah.
Surya
Yeah.
Urja Mission
Yeah. Yeah.
something.
Something. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
But
always have to copy it from their website. I just cannot remember.
cannot remember. Yes, yes, yes. That is a nice acronym. So Kusum has all these three components. So Kusum has one component around Kusum A is around an experiment that they did in Maharashtra. This is this organization Prayas. I think Prayas with the government did some very nice experiment there, where they actually, instead of having those solar panels on individual farmers' field, they actually have those panels centrally located, most possibly where the transformer is on the land of maybe the utility or something, and then they actually solarize the entire grid. While farmers are just doing as they were doing before, they have their same pumps, their same bore wells, etc. But the electricity that they're getting is coming from the solar grid. So as far as farmers are concerned, no change on their part. So that's basically what has now been converted into a Kusum A component, where a private entrepreneur or a government entity comes and solarizes the entire grid, so that's one. I mean, that's is still decentralized. It's still, and then that solar grid is again is connected to the main grid, of course. Then the Kusum B component, which is being promoted in Eastern India and many other states for that matter, is just standalone solar pumps. These are off-grid ones. These are not connected to the grid in any way. It's like a farmer gets panels, like installs panels on their fields, and then they get a, basically connect a pump and they run it whenever there's solar energy available. Then Kusum C has been formulated based on an experiment that Imi Tata and Tushar in the Anand office did in a village in Gujarat, where they actually had those, they connected, so farmers' fields have the solar panels, and then those panels are connected back to the grid. So farmer is able to take electricity from the grid, and he or she is also able to pump electricity back to the grid. So this has what become the Kusum C model, and the government of Gujarat then also piloted this other scheme called the Saurya Kishan Yojana, which is called Sky, which is a similar one in which farmers install these panels. Then so basically in a feeder, almost 70% of the farmers have to agree. Then the farmers would be connected. Every farmer would have a solar panel on their field and a pump, and all those panels are connected to the grid. And those farmers get 12 hours of daytime electricity. So one of the challenge here is, like many farmers in our country get nighttime electricity, but solar pumps won't work if the electricity comes at night. So the grid then remains open all throughout the day, and farmers are both producing as well as consuming at the same time. And whatever is the net difference between their consumption and production if they are producing and injecting to the grid more than what they're consuming, then they get a certain amount of money at the end of the year. However, if they're using more than they're producing, they would have to pay electricity bills. And this is precisely the scheme that we are doing detailed impact evaluations, etc. And we are finding very interesting, very preliminary results. But all those three models are there. And I feel in a country like India, we need those different models. We just simply cannot have one model fit all. And perhaps these three models are not enough. We just need literally like a let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of an idea, where there could be a lot more models. There could be models like mobile, where you have mobile solar pumps that nobody invests in it, but entrepreneurs actually go and sell electricity. Or you could have models like what we have in Bangladesh, where these are large pumps the investments have come from private entrepreneurs, and they are just working as a seller of irrigation services. So farmers aren't investing anything; they're paying an hourly or a seasonal price for water. Or you could have models like very small micro pumps simply for vegetable gardens, particularly suited for women and poor farmers, very smallholder farmers. So Nepal has some models where they have got groups of landless communities together. They have together leased in land and got very small pumps called sunflower pumps there. And they are doing these kind of high value crop like vegetables and all. So I feel that we require a lot different models. But right now, solar A, B, and C are pretty good. I mean, it depends on how well at the end of the day, it all depends on how well the state discoms are functioning. And we know that's where a lot of our issues are, right? So it's all, I mean, success of these will depend on how professional these discoms are, how badly they want to reduce their losses, etc.
I wanted to share an observation and also would like to know yours as well. I know you are into preliminary stage of studying Kusum as a scheme, but if we take a macro view on this issue, you also mentioned, and it's a reality, that how grid connected electricity reached so late in so many areas in this country. And we cannot imagine the villages and the rural areas which were devoid of electricity and had to resort to diesel pumps and what all for irrigation purposes. In this particular scheme comes which gives energy security, it's not dependent on any fuel. You run it via solar. But then again, there's an issue, as you mentioned, of discoms, of state governments who do not have that much revenue. So again, government has a big role to play in this to make this particular scheme successful. Another reason being that there has not been an aggressive private sector's interest in a scheme like Kusum, as it has been, if I can compare, to grid connected solar projects, where all the conglomerates of the world have landed. But something like that doesn't seem to be happening in Kusum, because it looks more like a socialist scheme. So how do you think, Matlab, based on this, how do you think could be the success rate? What is that little spice that could help this particular scheme to succeed?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, and I don't know if I have all the correct answer at this point. But I think it's quite difficult given the way our agriculture is. I mean, it's literally a loss-making enterprise now. It is. I mean, talk to any farmer. I mean, they're barely making profit. Why do you think private sector would go and invest there? And any private sector investments so far have not been so much to the interest of the farmers per se, right? So the kind you would have seen in rooftop solar, for instance. I mean, obviously, and for a long time, various states have tried to privatize their canal irrigation, no takers, because canal irrigation is a loss-making business. So as long as our agriculture doesn't become profit-making, it will be quite difficult to have a lot of private sector participation in that. And perhaps the reason agriculture is not profit making, but not only in our countries, but in many other countries, is also this entire imperative of keeping food prices low. I mean, on the one hand, we all talk about how increasing farmers' income, but if you watch TV, I'm sure you do, the moment onion prices go up or any price go up, that's where the urban people are out, with the mic saying that how do you buy onions for 50 rupees a kilo or whatever. I mean, I think there's a basic dichotomy that we have there between farmers' income and the expectation, the perpetual expectation that food prices would be low. And on the other hand, you can also very much say that not keeping food prices low would also literally make even more people go to bed hungry than they do now. So I think there is also this political exigency about keeping food prices low. But I keep wondering, how does that then gel with also trying to make the entire business more profitable for farmers? But that was, I think, more of an aside to not the main answer to your question. I was thinking on the solar schemes, be it Kusum or be it any other state government schemes like the Sky in Gujarat, or the Saurya Kisan Yojana, I think in CM Saurya Kisan Yojana in Maharashtra, or for any other state. It's really about how badly the utility wants to end its fossil fuel subsidies. So we know that irrigation gets a huge amount of subsidy because of the way it has been set up. There's a historical legacy there. And the idea is the utility interested in, or is the state government, not the utility, because the utility gets paid for the subsidy, right? I mean, the main player here is the state government. Is the state government interested in reducing those fossil fuel subsidies and move towards a renewable energy? Having said that, they still might have to pay some amount of subsidy, but perhaps those are better subsidies than subsidies for fossil fuel, right? I mean, what I find in the case of Gujarat, for instance, is perhaps a little bit more capital cost infusion from the government would have helped. Right now, farmers are having to pay 70% of the total cost of these systems. Perhaps a higher subsidy would have been even better for farmers to realize income. So what's happening is, in Gujarat, for instance, even though farmers are injecting quite a lot of power into the system, so almost all the farmers, almost 98% of the farmers are net energy importers, but only 50% of the farmers are earning income. So the difference between that, 98% of the farmers are putting energy into the grid. They're producing electricity for the state, right? But only 50% are earning actual income into their account. The difference really is that the remaining 50%, the remaining 48% who are not able to get income, for them, that income is going because they have to pay a loan to the state government. The state government has taken loan on their behalf to install those solar pumps. So a lot of their income actually is going in loan repayment, if that's clear and not too complex. So, and I think that is really discouraging them. I mean, they are saying that, okay, we are producing this energy and that is going, so that is kind of making the state one of the largest solar producer in the country. But then we are having to pay such a huge loan. So actually, we still need to think around financing. How do we finance this renewable energy in a way that farmers also benefit in the long run? So I think it's really turns down to how you process these finance packages and how much incentivized these discoms are in terms of moving away from the fossil fuel kind of regimes. I don't know if that quite answers your question, Shreya, and I'm also not quite finished thinking around these issues. We are just finding this very interesting.
Yeah, no, but
evidence.
this observation clearly helps. There's still a lot of permutation combination to go forward in this particular area. So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
We will get you back in another year or so to share what all
Yes,
your
we are
conclusions
hoping.
have been.
Yes, this year we are hoping to have a lot of publications. We are getting fascinating results from Nepal, Bangladesh, India. So this is our
great.
year of, yeah.
Well, look forward to
Fingers
it, and
crossed.
we will definitely have you again to talk about some of your results, and we can have a entire episode around some of your papers. I just want to steer this conversation a little bit more broader around the issue, or since we focus on energy and climate issues in our podcast, specifically sort of like focusing on adaptation, right? Of course, irrigation is, as you mentioned, important for an adaptation point of view. India has water, lots of water issues in different parts of the country. So like more generally, what are some of the key challenges for large scale adaptation strategies in India? And within that, if you can specifically focus on some water related adaptation issues, I think that will be very useful.
Yeah, so I feel, and as a water professional, I know we all water professionals agree that water has to be absolutely at the heart of adaptation. If air/carbon is about mitigation, then adaptation is really about water, because what we are finding also is the thing that farmers are adapting most to are water related hazards. Most of the adaptation in agriculture that are happening are in response to things like floods, droughts, rainfall variability, groundwater over extraction. If you go into the mountains, that's around drying of springs, melting of glaciers. So water actually lies at the heart of adaptation, because farmers are literally adapting to water related hazards. I mean, temperature surely, but most of those temperature ones, high temperature, etc., also gets reflected for a farmer in form of a drought, right? So that way. And also what we are finding is that many of the actual adaptation interventions are also water related. I talked about irrigation, but there is also soil water moisture conservation, rainwater harvesting in the urban areas, urban rooftop water harvesting, and many of those. The third point around water and adaptation, I would think, is that the first is all the adaptation, majority of the adaptation, even the recent GAMI analysis that was there, a global adaptation mapping initiative, and a lot of papers came out. If you look at that, that also shows that almost 60% of the hazards to which to people worldwide are adapting are actually water related hazards. The second point is also a lot of the adaptation itself is water related, adaptation interventions, as I mentioned, in the context of agriculture, obviously. Then the third part is that many of the mitigation measures also have a very high water footprint, either a trade-off or a synergy. Coming to solar irrigation, for instance, many fear that solar irrigation, because of zero marginal cost of extracting water, it may have negative water impacts, groundwater over extraction. So I feel that water is terribly important in all of those adaptation. But in a context of India, I am not sure if our schemes or if our quote unquote development projects are looked at from any climate resilience, climate adaptation, mitigation point of view. I think we are still stuck in that old fashioned development paradigm. And what I find quite interesting, and I was thinking, for instance, I used to do some spring related work in Bhutan, and I attended some of their meetings. And in all the meetings, I would hear this particular phrase that in Bhutan, any policy is actually scanned through a particular lens of gross national happiness. Does that policy increase gross national happiness? And I found that so interesting, because no policy would pass the muster unless those ones proposing it shows that how does it increase gross national happiness. I feel in India, are we doing the same? I mean, now that we are in the middle of climate change, India is one of the climate change hotspots. This is where most of the vulnerability is. Are our policymakers actually similarly scanning all the policies from a point of view of whether it will increase our resilience or adaptive capacity? And I don't think we are doing that. I mean, we still have policies that would lead to more greenhouse gas emissions, that would lead to it may increase income. Well, that's also questionable. But I'm not sure if it answers your question, but I just feel that we aren't doing enough, and there is still this attitude that climate change is a second order issue. We have many more important and urgent developmental concerns, without the realization that those development concerns can actually undermine our adaptive capacity and increase vulnerability. So the original intention, if it's about, say, doubling farmers' income by 2022 or whatever, I mean, how do you do that while being also climate resilient? So that's a huge gap, and there are no easy answers. And to me, it seems like we should be increasingly scanning our policies to see if those policies are climate resilient or not. And I don't think it's been done at all.
I wanted to ask, now that we are talking about climate adaptation, we are just months into this COP26 that just happened. I wanted to ask you, what did you think of the discussions and outcomes at COP26 for addressing water security, hydrological issues? As you mentioned, India is one of the most vulnerable countries, along with other developing, least developed countries. Island nations took a very strong stand in COP26 this year. But overall, what did you think of the discussions that happened for this particular space in COP26?
The funny thing is that for the very first time in COP, in these 26 years of COP, that there was a water pavilion. I mean, so much of our climate discussions around carbon that we almost, I feel that we aren't giving enough importance to the water and the impact of climate change and the hydrological cycle. We all know that floods and droughts are the issues that is facing. I mean, everybody is facing that, but somehow that floods and droughts or water issues is something that I don't think is very like, how do I say, it's not a part of the climate discussion. Somehow water is still not a part of the climate discussions, and I feel that kind of the reason why we never had a separated dedicated water pavilion in the COP. But this was for the first year that I think almost 100 plus organizations came together with the leadership of CV, Stockholm International Water Institute, and EMI was a partner, but there were lots of partners, IUCN, WWF, I mean, a host of over 100 people, and there was a separate water pavilion, which actually raised the profile of water within the COP discussions. I scanned the Glasgow declaration, but I don't think water finds any particular mention there. So there is a lot of expectation that the next two are happening in Egypt, and I think UAE after that, if I'm not mistaken. And both those are very water scarce parts. So there is a lot of expectation that COP27 will see a lot more water related discussions than any of the COP have found before that. So all the organizations that are related to the water one, I mean, there's a lot of discussions going on how to raise the profile of water within the climate discussions. So I mean, in some, I just think that so much of our climate discussions are around mitigation, and when it comes to adaptation, while this entire thing, I mean, within the water community is very clear that water is central to adaptation, but I don't think the adaptation community as a whole looks at it that way. So there's still a lot of ground that the water people need to cover to actually convince the others that water needs to play an important part in adaptation, which it already is. So there is still a case that we need to make as water professionals to raise the profile of water within climate change discussions. I don't think we are doing enough yet.
Excellent. I think that is a perfect segue for the next question, which is like, what kind of geopolitical or cross climatic zones cooperation can be done to ensure water security for vulnerable communities, be it in India or like Bangladesh or basically South Asia. As you mentioned, I mean, and it's very thought provoking how you connected and sort of tied everything to water security and importance of water in terms of adaptation. So what kind of cooperation should be built? If you were a policymaker in India, what would be some of the kinds of cooperations that you would try to build?
That's again a terrific question. I think so much of our water cooperation discussions have been put in this early unfortunate state of a win-lose game. It's like a zero sum game. If a downstream neighbor gets more water, we have less water. If an upstream neighbor takes more water, then the downstream has less. So this zero sum game kind of a thing, and also conflating water security with national security, I think has been also a historical folly. The moment you were saying that our water security is central to our national security, you are going down that blind alley where everything you are looking through a zero sum game. You have to really think of those win-win options. So that's the one point, that our entire journey around transboundary cooperation has been framed either as a security issue or as a zero sum issue. So there's where we haven't been able to make much progress, frankly, so far, especially when it comes to surface water issues, etc. The second thing, where on the other hand, cooperation has been quite easy, is when it comes to things like hazards. I mean, which we wrongly call as disasters. I mean, natural disasters. I mean, don't exist. I mean, it's the disasters are always human made, but basically, when it comes to disasters, we find that there's a lot more cooperation that's possible. So you would find that even between say India, Pakistan, or India, Bangladesh, where there are lots of water issues, but when it comes to early flood warning, or India, China for that matter, all the upstream neighbors have been willing to share information. If a certain, like, if the river flows extend a certain limit and it can cause floods downstream, so those kind of early warning systems have come up in more of a bilateral basis. And I think when it comes to the cooperation comes to kind of more concrete and smaller things, instead of covering everything. For instance, when it comes to something like mountains, so this EC mode where I used to work earlier, so this EC mode itself, that organization is an intergovernmental organization of 8 governments in the Hindu Kush Himalayas, and they have been trying to do something around like the Himalayan Council, on the lines of the Arctic Council. So you have these Arctic Council in Arctic, obviously, where there is kind of an intergovernmental organization. So EC mode has been promoting something like that for the past 4 or 5 years or so, and that I think has an appeal, because there's already an organization that has, all the board members of EC mode, for example, has a representation from all these 8 countries, and the issue of melting of glaciers is something that really unites all these countries. Then I think, again, cooperation is easy when it comes to more technological kind of things like early warning systems. But then cooperation becomes hard the moment you are framing it as, I win, you lose. So again, having said all of this, transboundary cooperation is not really my own area of expertise. So this is what I understand as an outsider to the whole issue, that we have to be very topic based. Water security should not be conflated with national security.
So, from this macro issue of climate adaptation impacting water security and everything, let's come to this very, very micro issue in India. I correct me if I'm wrong, but until very recently, India did not have a dedicated policy or ministry for that matter for ensuring drinking water for all. Now there is a ministry, there is a nationwide mission, Har Nal Jal mission, which ensures tap drinking water for all. So, but do you think this solves the basic issue? A separate ministry or a separate policy for that matter solves this issue? Why I ask is that it's a very municipal level issues for providing drinking water for all. Pune has been a great example, but municipality across these countries are financially and operationally in shambles. So, do you think this particular policy, this ministry can make headways into this particular problem of the country?
I think that, again, like everything, the policy is great, especially if it supports in rehabilitating or revitalizing these local municipalities. One of the things about climate change adaptation that Professor Salimul Haq keeps talking about, that the adaptation has to be locally led. We cannot think of a central government leading adaptation. So in that case, if this particular scheme, I think it's Har Nal Ko Pani, Har Ghar Ko Pani, something like this particular universal drinking water, tap drinking water scheme can actually invest in capacity building and improving financial viability capacity of the municipalities. That would be a great example. My worry with this scheme is that constructing taps is easy, constructing pipelines is easy, but my concern is that those pipelines may be just full of air and not water, because that's where the problem is. Where will the water come from? And interestingly, I was going through the guidelines of this policy, and I do see that some amount of money would be earmarked for treating watersheds and the catchment areas, which I think is a good move. If we can also protect the water at the catchment, then I think you are solving. So it's not only about, it's not, how do I say, it's not about pipes and taps. the real issue is about water, and the real issue is about equity in that water distribution. And a couple of things again, it's also about the local, empowering the local municipalities. If all those things happen in tandem, yes, but if you are forgetting one component of these, and my fear is that taps and pipes would be built the fastest, empowering the municipalities won't. At the same time, going back to the supply chain and treating the watersheds, treating the catchment areas also won't happen, because at the same time, coming to the Himalayas and the springs, where we have recently completed some work that was recently published by the Niti Aayog. That was a work that we had done with the Niti Aayog once. I think while there is a lot of focus on conserving springs in the Himalayas and reviving springs in the Himalayas, in tandem, you also have policies for more and more road construction in the Himalayas, for more and more hydropower in the Himalayas. So what we really have is in India a lot of policy incoherence. I mean, if you are conserving catchments, then you have to have those catchment kind of maps where those are the recharge areas of the springs, and literally protect those areas from development projects like roads. The moment you build a road, and if it kind of divides your recharge area from your discharge spring point, those springs will dry. Similarly, if you're making a hydropower, your entire catchment dynamics gets disturbed. So on the one hand, we are almost not protecting our water sources. On the other hand, we are saying everybody would have tap water at their house, and these two are not compatible with each other. You cannot have necessarily tapped water at home unless you have been protecting these catchment areas in a systematic way over the long term. But I think the objective, if it can in the process make the municipals more professional, it can generate more revenues for them, then nothing like it. I agree with you. Our municipalities, they're in complete shambles, actually.
Well, that's really great. And thank you so much. I think, we really learned a lot at least I learned a lot in the last 1 hour. It's been such a treat to talk to you about these wide ranging issues from, solar pumps to adaptation to bigger issues of transboundary and finally to drinking water. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, we covered like a whole gamut of issues. So yeah, it was very interesting. Thank you so much. We actually did learn a lot. This is a subject that, as you rightly said, very few people know about it or try to know about it. So it's been a learning experience for us as well. And I think going forward, in our discussions on energy, I think water should be given a prominent point of discussion, I guess. Because it will play a larger role in climate discussions or energy discussions, I believe.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_Jay and at Sandeep Pai with double I.